There's a photograph you've probably never seen, taken in 1876, somewhere in the hills of Western Virginia. A family stands in front of a wooden farmhouse, 15 people, maybe more. Their faces are blurred by the long exposure, but their eyes are clear. And if you look closely, really closely, you'll notice something unsettling. Not one of them is smiling, not the children, not the mother holding an infant against her chest, not the patriarch standing at the center, his hand resting on a cane that seems too heavy for walking. And this is the Colt family. And this photograph is one of the last times they would all be together before the darkness that lived inside their bloodline began to surface. And you won't find their story in textbooks. It's not taught in schools. The Colt name has been scrubbed from most historical records, buried beneath layers of legal documents, court transcripts, and whispered warnings passed down through generations. But the truth has a way of surviving. It hides in old letters, in medical reports, in the testimony of children who were never supposed to speak. And the Colt family legacy isn't one of war heroes or industrial pioneers. It's not a tale of American triumph. It's something else entirely, something that makes you question how much evil can live inside a single name and how long it can survive when no one dares to stop it. And for over a century, the Colts lived in isolation, first in Virginia, then deeper into the Appalachian wilderness, where the roads didn't reach and the law didn't follow. They built their lives in the shadows of mountains, far from towns and far from questions. And in that isolation, something twisted, something that started as secrecy became tradition. What began as control became horror, and the family tree, when you trace it back, doesn't branch the way it should. The names repeat, the bloodlines loop back on themselves. Marriages that were never legal, children born from unions that were never meant to happen, and through it all, a silence so thick it felt like soil. And by the time authorities became involved, it was already too late for some. The damage had been done across generations. The trauma had been passed down like inheritance. And the children, God, the children, they didn't even know there was another way to live. And what you're about to hear isn't easy. It's not entertainment in the way we've come to expect. This is the kind of truth that sits heavy in your chest, that makes you wonder how something like this could happen in a country that prides itself on freedom and justice. But it did happen. And it happened not in some distant land or ancient time. It happened here, in America, in living memory. And the Colt family story forces us to confront an uncomfortable question: what happens when a family becomes a closed system? When the outside world is kept at bay, when secrecy is enforced with violence, when children are taught that suffering is normal, what kind of darkness grows in that soil? And this isn't a ghost story. There are no monsters here, at least not the kind you can see. The horror is human. The evil is generational, and the legacy is still unfolding, even now, in ways that most people will never understand. And so before we go further, you need to know, this isn't a story with a neat ending. There's no hero who saves the day. There's no moment of redemption that makes it all okay. There's only the truth. And the truth in this case is a wound that never fully healed. And the Colt family legacy is a reminder that some bloodlines carry more than DNA. They carry secrets. They carry shame. And sometimes they carry a kind of darkness that no amount of time can wash away. And let's begin where most people never dare to look, at the roots. And the first Colt to settle in the Virginia hills was a man named Samuel. The year was 1843. He arrived with a wife, 3 children, and a wagon full of tools. Everything a man would need to carve out a life in the wilderness. The locals who saw him pass through town remembered him as quiet, polite even. He paid for his supplies in cash, asked no questions, and offered no explanations about where he'd come from or why he'd chosen such remote land. And that should have been the first warning. And Samuel Colt bought 200 acres on the edge of what was then considered uninhabitable territory. The land was cheap because nobody wanted it. Too rocky for farming, too isolated for trade. The nearest town was a full day's ride, and that was in good weather. In winter the roads became impassable. The Colts would be alone for months at a time, and that's exactly what Samuel wanted. And the family built their homestead deep in a hollow, surrounded by ridges that blocked them from view. They dug a well, raised a barn, planted crops that barely grew in the thin mountain soil. To anyone who might have stumbled upon them, they would have looked like just another struggling frontier family trying to survive. But Samuel wasn't struggling. He was hiding, and within 5 years, his wife gave birth to 4 more children. Then 3 more after that. The family grew, but they never came to town. They never attended church. They never sent their children to the schoolhouse that had been built 10 miles south. When a traveling preacher tried to visit in 1852, he was turned away at gunpoint. Samuel Colt made it clear his family didn't need saving, and they didn't need visitors. And the people in town talked, of course. They always do. Rumors spread about what might be happening up in that hollow. Some said Samuel was running from the law. Others whispered that he was involved in something darker, maybe witchcraft, maybe worse. But the frontier had a code: you didn't go poking around in another man's business unless it directly affected you. And for decades, the Colts kept to themselves, and it wasn't until Samuel's children reached adulthood that the pattern began to reveal itself, and his oldest daughter, Mary, never left the property. Neither did his second daughter, Ruth, or his sons, Jacob and Eli. When they reached marrying age, there were no courtships with families from town. No young men came calling. No daughters were introduced to suitable matches. The Colt children simply stayed, and then the next generation was born. And the records from this period are sparse, but what exists is damning. Birth registrations were rarely filed. When they were, the names of the fathers were often left blank or listed with impossible dates, men who would have been too old, or too young, or already dead. The marriages, when they were recorded at all, listed family members with the same last name, brothers and sisters, cousins. Sometimes, the relationships were so tangled that it became impossible to tell who was parent and who was sibling, and by the time Samuel Colt died in 1881, the family had grown to nearly 30 people, and not one of them had ever left the hollow, and the isolation wasn't just geographical anymore. It was psychological, generational. The children born into the Colt family didn't know there was a world beyond the ridges. They didn't know that the way they lived, the things that happened in the dark, the rules that governed their bodies, the silence that was enforced with fists and worse. They didn't know that none of it was normal, and Samuel's son Jacob took over as patriarch after his death. And under Jacob's rule, the secrecy deepened. Outsiders were no longer just discouraged, they were threatened. A surveyor who tried to map the property in 1889 was chased off with dogs. A census taker who climbed the ridge in 1900 reported that he'd been met by a group of men with rifles who told him, in no uncertain terms, that the Colt family didn't participate in government counts. But the most chilling part, the census taker said he saw children watching from the windows of the house. Dozens of them, their faces pale and thin, none of them making a sound, and he reported what he saw to the county sheriff, but nothing was done. This was Appalachia at the turn of the century. Families had rights, property had boundaries, and unless there was a crime committed in plain sight, the law didn't intervene, and so the Colts remained untouched. The bloodline continued to fold in on itself, and the children kept being born into a legacy they would never escape, and by 1920, the family had moved deeper into the mountains, abandoning the original homestead for an even more remote location. They were ghosts now. Whispers, a name that appeared on old land deeds but nowhere else. And in that silence, the true horror was just beginning. And there's a term psychologists use when describing families like the Colts. They call it enmeshment. It's when the boundaries between individuals dissolve. When a family stops being a collection of separate people and becomes something else. A single organism that feeds on itself. Where loyalty isn't love, it's survival. Where secrecy isn't protection, it's control. And the Colt family didn't just live in isolation. They weaponized it, and by the 1930s, the family had fractured into smaller units, scattered across different properties throughout the mountains. But they stayed connected. They visited each other in the dead of night. They traded children between households. They enforced the old rules, the ones that Samuel had established, the ones that Jacob had made even stricter, the rules that said you don't leave, you don't speak to outsiders, you don't question what happens inside these walls. And if you break the rules, you disappear. And there are stories, passed down through the few people who lived near Colt properties, about strange sounds in the night, screaming that would start and then suddenly stop, gunshots fired at odd hours, graves dug in the woods with no markers, no names, no explanations. One old woman, interviewed in the 1970s before she died, said her father had once stumbled across a clearing on Colt land where the soil had been freshly turned. He counted 7 mounds, he never went back. And the children born into this world didn't have childhoods. Not in any recognizable sense. They were taught to work before they could read. They were taught to obey before they could speak full sentences. And they were taught, in ways too dark to fully articulate, that their bodies didn't belong to them, and medical records, when they exist at all from this period, tell a horrifying story. Multiple children treated for broken bones that were never properly set, infections that should have been treated weeks earlier, malnutrition in an area where game was plentiful and crops could be grown. One doctor, writing in his personal journal in 1938, described examining a 12-year-old Colt girl who had injuries consistent with repeated sexual trauma. When he asked her what happened, she told him it was normal. When he asked if he could speak to her parents, she ran out of his office and never returned, and he reported it to the sheriff. The sheriff did nothing, And this was the unspoken agreement in rural Appalachia. You didn't interfere with family business. You didn't ask questions about what happened behind closed doors. And you certainly didn't accuse prominent landowners, even ones as reclusive as the Colts, of crimes you couldn't prove. But the silence had consequences. Every year that passed without intervention was another year of children being born into abuse. Another year of trauma becoming tradition. Another year of the Colt bloodline tightening around itself like a noose. And by the 1950s, some of the younger Colts began trying to escape. A teenage boy made it as far as the county line before his uncles found him and dragged him back. A young woman managed to get to a church in town, begging the pastor for help. But when the pastor drove out to the Colt property to investigate, he was met by the family patriarch, a man named Ezra Colt, Jacob's grandson, who calmly explained that the girl was mentally unstable, that she had episodes, that the family was caring for her the best they could, and the pastor believed him, or maybe he just didn't want to know the truth. And the girl was never seen in town again. And what's perhaps most disturbing about this period is how normalized it all became. The Colts weren't seen as monsters by their neighbors. They were just seen as strange, backward, a little too isolated for their own good. People made jokes about them, called them hillbillies, talked about inbreeding in the abstract like it was a curiosity rather than a crime. But inside those walls, inside those scattered homes deep in the mountains, there was nothing abstract about it. There were children being raised in darkness, literally and figuratively. Some of them never saw a school, never learned to read, never understood that the way they lived was not the way everyone lived, and the family made sure of it. They controlled information like a prison warden controls cells. No newspapers, no radio, no contact with the outside world that wasn't strictly supervised. The children were taught that outsiders were dangerous, that the government wanted to destroy their family, that the only people they could trust were other Colts, and it's a tactic as old as abuse itself. Isolate the victim, control the narrative, make them believe that their suffering is normal, or worse, that it's their fault. And by the time the 1960s arrived, the Colt family had been operating in the shadows for over a century. 5 generations had been born into this cycle. 5 generations of children who never had a chance. And the truly terrifying part, nobody stopped them. Not because they couldn't, but because they didn't want to look. And the first real crack in the Colt family's fortress came in 1972, not from law enforcement, not from social services, but from a fire. And it started in the early hours of a March morning in one of the Colt properties nestled in a valley so remote that the nearest fire department was 40 miles away. By the time anyone saw the smoke, the house was already half gone. The flames tore through the old wooden structure like it was made of paper. And when the volunteer firefighters finally arrived 3 hours later, they found something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. And 7 children, huddled together in what remained of the root cellar. The oldest couldn't have been more than 14. The youngest was barely 3. They were covered in soot and burns, their clothes sinned, their eyes wide with terror. But it wasn't the fire that shocked the firefighters. It was the condition of the children, and they were emaciated, covered in scars, some old, some fresh. Several had teeth that were rotting out of their mouths. The youngest had a broken arm that had clearly healed wrong, twisted at an unnatural angle. And when the paramedics tried to examine them, the children recoiled like animals that had been beaten too many times. And none of them would say what happened. None of them would say who their parents were. And when the authorities tried to piece together who owned the property, the records were a labyrinth of shell companies, dead relatives, and forged signatures. It was as if the house didn't officially exist, and the children were taken to a hospital in Charleston. Doctors examined them and found evidence of chronic abuse and neglect spanning years, malnutrition, untreated infections, signs of sexual trauma in multiple children. One of the doctors described it as the worst case of systematic child abuse he'd ever encountered in 30 years of practice. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. And within 72 hours of being admitted to the hospital, family members arrived. They claimed to be aunts, uncles, cousins, all carrying documents that appeared legitimate enough to confuse the overworked hospital administrators. They said the children belonged with family, that they'd been through enough trauma, that taking them away from their blood would only cause more harm. And somehow, inexplicably, the authorities let them go, and not all of them. 3 of the children were kept in state custody, but 4 were released back to the family, back into the mountains, back into the darkness. And within a month, those 4 children had vanished from all official records. No school enrollment, no medical follow-ups, no welfare checks, and it was as if they'd never existed. And the 3 who remained in state custody told fragments of a story that was almost too horrific to believe. They spoke about the family way, about rules that were enforced with violence, about babies being born and then disappearing, about older family members doing things to younger ones that made them bleed, made them cry, made them wish they were dead. But their testimony was fragmented, inconsistent. They'd been so thoroughly traumatized and conditioned that they couldn't articulate what had happened in a way that would hold up in court. And without physical evidence, without a clear perpetrator to charge, the case fell apart, and a social worker assigned to the case wrote in her report, "These children have been raised in a cult-like environment where abuse is normalized and resistance is punished. They don't even have the language to describe what was done to them. It's as if they were raised in a different country, with different laws, different morals, different rules about what human beings are allowed to do to each other." And the case was eventually closed. The 3 children who'd been rescued were placed in foster care, where they struggled for years to adapt to normal life. One of them would later commit suicide at age 23. Another disappeared into the system and was never heard from again. The third, a girl named Sarah, would eventually become the key to unraveling the full scope of the Colt family's crimes. But that wouldn't happen for another 30 years. And throughout the 1980s and 90s, there were sporadic reports. A trucker who picked up a teenage boy hitchhiking and noticed he had the cognitive development of a much younger child. A nurse who treated a young woman in an emergency room and found evidence of a recent childbirth, but the woman insisted she'd never been pregnant. A teacher who briefly encountered a Colt child at a county fair and was disturbed by how the child flinched at every sudden movement. But these were isolated incidents, fragments, pieces of a puzzle that nobody was putting together because nobody wanted to see the full picture. And the Colt family had learned over generations how to exist in the spaces between systems, how to exploit the gaps in oversight, how to use rural isolation, bureaucratic incompetence, and social discomfort to their advantage. They understood that people don't want to believe the worst is possible, that authorities don't want to wade into complex family situations without clear evidence, that communities don't want to acknowledge that such evil could exist in their own backyard, and so the abuse continued, the bloodline continued, and the children kept being born into a legacy that destroyed them before they ever had a chance to live. And in 2007, a woman walked into a police station in southern West Virginia. She was in her early 50s, thin to the point of frailty, with eyes that looked decades older than her face. She told the officer at the desk that her name was Sarah Colt and that she needed to report crimes that had been committed over the course of 40 years. And the officer, to his credit, didn't dismiss her. He sat her down, he gave her coffee, and he listened, and what Sarah told him over the next 6 hours would launch one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in Appalachian history. And Sarah was one of the children rescued from the fire in 1972. She'd spent her teenage years bouncing between foster homes, struggling with PTSD, battling addiction, trying to outrun memories that wouldn't let her go. She'd attempted suicide twice. She'd been institutionalized 3 times. And for decades, she'd convinced herself that maybe she'd imagined it all. Maybe it hadn't been as bad as she remembered. Maybe her mind had exaggerated the horror to make sense of the chaos. But then she had a daughter of her own. And watching that little girl grow up, seeing her innocence, her trust, her fundamental right to safety, something broke open inside Sarah. She realized with crushing clarity that what had been done to her was not normal. It was not excusable. And it was still happening, and she started investigating on her own. She tracked down records. She found court documents from the 1972 case that had been sealed. She located other former Colt family members who'd escaped or been cast out, and what she uncovered was a network of abuse that spanned 6 generations and involved dozens of perpetrators. And the Colt family, she explained to police, wasn't just one household. It was a constellation of properties across 3 states, Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky. Different branches of the family controlled different territories, but they all followed the same rules. Children were treated as property. They were traded between households like livestock. They were bred, and yes, that was the word Sarah used, bred, to keep the bloodline pure. And the family had a twisted ideology that justified everything. They believed outsiders were corrupt, that the government wanted to destroy traditional families, that they were preserving something sacred by keeping their bloodline isolated. It was a combination of extreme religious fundamentalism, paranoid conspiracy thinking, and multi-generational sexual abuse masquerading as tradition, and Sarah provided names, locations, dates. She described a hierarchy within the family, patriarchs who made decisions, enforcers who punished disobedience, and victims who were too broken or too young to fight back. She explained how children were conditioned from birth to accept abuse as normal, how they were denied education specifically to keep them ignorant of their rights, how pregnancy was forced on girls as young as 12 to produce the next generation. And then she told them about the ones who didn't survive. And there were children, Sarah said, who'd been born with severe disabilities, likely the result of generations of inbreeding. Some of these children disappeared. Sarah remembered a baby born with profound deformities when she was 9 years old. The baby cried for 2 days, and then it went silent. She never saw it again. No birth certificate was filed, no death certificate either. It was as if the child had never existed, and the investigators began pulling at threads. They obtained warrants. They started surveillance on known Colt properties, and in 2009, they executed coordinated raids across 7 locations in 3 states. And what they found was worse than anything Sarah had described, and in one house, they discovered 11 children living in conditions that defied comprehension. No running water, no electricity, feces on the floors, children sleeping in closets. A 13-year-old girl who was 5 months pregnant and couldn't identify the father, or perhaps was too terrified to say. And in another location, they found a basement that had been converted into makeshift cells. Locks on the outside of doors, chains bolted to walls, evidence that people had been confined there for extended periods. And in a third property they found graves. Shallow, unmarked graves in the woods behind the house. Forensic teams would eventually uncover the remains of 4 individuals, 3 children and 1 adult. Cause of death could not be determined due to decomposition, but the circumstances were damning enough, and 17 adults were arrested in the initial raids. 32 children were removed from Colt family properties and placed in protective custody. And the testimony that followed, given by children who'd never known anything but abuse, would make seasoned investigators break down in tears. And if you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? How do you stop something that's been buried for generations? And because here's the uncomfortable truth that the Colt case forces us to confront, this didn't happen in some distant past. This wasn't medieval Europe or ancient Rome. This was happening in modern America, in the age of the internet, in the era of mandatory reporting laws and child protective services. And nobody stopped it for 150 years. And the trials began in 2011. They would drag on for nearly 4 years, becoming a legal nightmare that exposed just how unprepared the justice system was to handle multi-generational, systematic familial abuse on this scale. And the prosecutors faced a problem that seemed almost insurmountable. How do you charge people for crimes when the victims don't understand they were victimized? How do you get testimony from children who've been so thoroughly conditioned that they defend their abusers? How do you prove intent when the defendants genuinely believe they were following tradition, not breaking laws? And the Colt family members who stood trial offered a defense that was as disturbing as it was predictable. They claimed they were being persecuted for their lifestyle, that the government was attacking them because they lived differently, that they were a religious family being oppressed for their beliefs. They painted themselves as victims of state overreach, as modern-day pioneers being punished for refusing to conform. And in some corners of the internet, in certain libertarian circles, in pockets of the conspiracy-minded community, people believed them. But the evidence was undeniable. Medical examinations of the children revealed patterns of abuse that couldn't be explained away. DNA testing confirmed what everyone suspected. The family tree was a closed loop of incestuous relationships spanning multiple generations. Several of the children had genetic abnormalities consistent with repeated inbreeding, cognitive impairments, physical deformities, immune deficiencies, and one 12-year-old boy had the intellectual capacity of a 6-year-old. A 14-year-old girl couldn't read or write her own name. A 9-year-old had never seen a television, didn't know what a car was called, thought the police were government demons who stole children, and the psychological evaluations were even more damning. Child after child described a world where sexual abuse was normalized, where violence was expected, where questioning authority meant beatings or worse. One therapist described it as the most complete case of psychological captivity she'd ever encountered. The children didn't just experience trauma, they'd been raised inside it, like plants grown in toxic soil, but getting convictions proved difficult. The defense attorneys were relentless. They argued that the children's testimony was unreliable because they'd been coached by social workers. They claimed the medical evidence was circumstantial. They attacked the credibility of Sarah Colt, pointing to her history of mental illness and substance abuse as proof she was an unreliable witness. And then they exploited a legal gray area that most people don't realize exists in some jurisdictions. If abuse happens within a family structure and both parties claim it was consensual, it's incredibly hard to prosecute. The law is built on the assumption that adults can consent. But what happens when someone has been so thoroughly groomed from childhood that they don't even understand what consent means? And in the end, only 9 of the 17 arrested family members were convicted. The charges ranged from child abuse and neglect to sexual assault of a minor. The sentences ranged from 5 years to 25 years. None of them got life. None of them were charged with murder, despite the bodies found on their property, because prosecutors couldn't prove cause of death beyond reasonable doubt. And the patriarch of the family at the time of the raids, a man named Josiah Colt, was 73 years old when he was sentenced. He showed no remorse. During his sentencing hearing, he read a prepared statement about how the government had destroyed his family, how they'd torn children from their loving homes, how history would vindicate him. And the judge, a woman who'd presided over the entire trial, did something unusual. She interrupted him, and she said, "Mr. Colt, I've sat through months of testimony. I've read medical reports that made me physically ill. I've watched video interviews of children describing abuse they don't even have words for. And you stand here talking about your family being destroyed. Your family destroyed itself, sir. Your family destroyed every child born into it for over 100 years, and the only tragedy is that it took this long for someone to stop you." And Josiah Colt died in prison 3 years later. Heart attack. He was 76, but his death didn't end the story. Because the damage the Colt family inflicted doesn't die with the perpetrators. It lives on in the survivors, and the 32 children removed from Colt properties were placed in foster care, group homes, and specialized treatment facilities. Most of them struggled to adapt to normal life. They had severe trust issues, educational deficits that would take years to overcome, social skills that had to be built from scratch. Several of them ran away from foster care, trying to return to the family, not because they loved their abusers, but because captivity was all they'd ever known, and freedom was terrifying. And one social worker who worked with the Colt children for 5 years said something that stayed with everyone who heard it. These kids don't need rescuing from their past. They need help learning how to have a future, because the Colt family didn't just abuse their bodies, they stole their ability to imagine that life could be different. And some of the children made it. They got educations. They found families who genuinely cared for them. They learned, slowly and painfully, what healthy relationships looked like. A few of them even started families of their own, determined to break the cycle. But others didn't make it. The statistics are grim. Of the 32 children removed in 2009, 4 have died, 2 by suicide, 1 from a drug overdose, 1 in a car accident that may not have been accidental. 7 are currently incarcerated for various crimes. 12 have had their own children removed by Child Protective Services due to neglect or abuse. And the trauma doesn't just disappear because you escape. It embeds itself in your nervous system. It shapes how you see the world. And unless you get intensive, long-term help, you risk passing it on to the next generation. And today, if you drive through the mountains of Appalachia where the Colt family once lived, you'll find empty houses, rotting structures reclaimed by the forest, foundations crumbling back into the earth. The properties have been abandoned, some seized by the state, others simply left to decay because no one wants to buy land with that kind of history. But the legacy doesn't end with empty houses, and there are still Colts out there. Family members who were never charged. Distant relatives who claim they didn't know what was happening. Children who aged out of the system and disappeared into society, carrying names they sometimes change, carrying trauma they can never fully shed. And then there are the questions that will never be answered. And how many children were born into the Colt family over 6 generations? The best estimates put it somewhere between 200 and 300, but the records are so fragmented that no one knows for certain. How many of them suffered abuse? How many died and were never reported? How many graves are still out there in those woods, unmarked and forgotten? And Sarah Colt, the woman who finally brought the family's crimes to light, gave one final interview in 2019. She was 64 years old by then, her health failing from decades of hard living and harder memories. She was asked if she felt like she'd gotten justice, and her answer was simple: there is no justice for what was done. You can't undo a childhood. You can't give back years that were stolen. You can't erase memories that wake you up screaming. All you can do is make sure it stops, and even then, you wonder if you really stopped it, or if it just went deeper underground. And she died 6 months later, lung cancer. She was buried in a small cemetery in West Virginia, far from any Colt family property. Her daughter, the one she'd fought so hard to protect, gave the eulogy. She said her mother spent her entire life trying to save children she'd never met from a family she'd barely escaped. That she carried guilt for the ones she couldn't save. That she never forgave herself for not speaking up sooner. But here's what Sarah Colt's daughter said that matters most. My mother taught me that silence is how evil survives, that families can be the most dangerous places in the world when no one is watching, and that the only way to stop monsters is to drag them into the light, no matter how much it hurts to look. And the Colt family case changed how authorities approach familial abuse in isolated communities. New protocols were established. Training was implemented for social workers and law enforcement on how to recognize signs of systematic, multi-generational abuse. Child Protective Services increased monitoring of homeschooled children in remote areas, but the uncomfortable truth is that it's still happening. Maybe not on the scale of the Colts, maybe not for 150 years, but right now in rural areas across America, there are families living in isolation. There are children being hurt behind closed doors. There are communities that look the other way because they don't want to know, don't want to get involved, don't want to believe that such evil could exist so close to home. And the Colt family isn't an aberration. It's an extreme example of something that happens more often than we want to admit. What occurs when power goes unchecked, when abuse becomes normalized, when silence is enforced across generations. And perhaps the most haunting part of this entire story is how easily it could have been stopped. At any point over 150 years, someone could have intervened. The doctor who saw that injured girl in 1938 could have pushed harder. The pastor who was turned away could have called the police. The census taker who saw those silent children could have demanded an investigation. The firefighters in 1972 could have refused to let those children go back, but they didn't. And by the time someone finally did, generations had already been destroyed, and there's a marker now on the site where the original Colt homestead stood. It was placed there by a coalition of abuse survivors and child advocacy groups. It doesn't say much, just, in memory of the children who suffered here, may their voices finally be heard, and the Colt family legacy is buried in those mountains. But it's also alive in the survivors who carry it forward. Some of them are healing, some of them are still fighting, and some of them are lost in ways that no amount of therapy or time will ever fully fix. And this is the cost of silence. This is what happens when we decide that some things are too uncomfortable to confront. When we tell ourselves that what happens in other families isn't our business. When we choose not to see what's right in front of us because seeing it would require us to act. And the dark side of the Colt family legacy isn't just what they did. It's what we allowed them to do by looking away. And the questions we should all be asking ourselves is this: what are we looking away from right now? What horrors are happening in our own communities while we convince ourselves it's not our problem? How many children are suffering in silence while we scroll past, drive by, decide not to get involved? And the Colt family story is a warning, not about one family of monsters in the mountains, but about what becomes possible when good people decide that evil is someone else's responsibility, and the darkness was always there.